lots of people, the world gets smaller, a bit duller, a bit dimmer, and certainly treats you less fairly. I'm a great advocate for the rights of all the people who rightly so. But it is what's that David said, old age and age assistance?
Yes, that's right. Well, there are a lot of very lonely older people. It's nothing to that's long before the lockdown. A lot of people, when they lose a purpose in life, once their jobs are finished and their duty and responsibility for themselves and others has gone away, the empty nest has left them perhaps lonely. Bereavement leaves you very lonely. So, what to do when you have the rest of your life to live and without the sense of purpose that gave it reality? And it makes people very unhappy. Some of them take up golf, and some of them take up volunteering, some of them take up painting. But the point is, you do need a reason for getting up in the morning. You need to have a purpose to fill the day with something. And I'm aware that a great many older people don't have a sense of direction on how to handle that.
Have you been stymied by lockdown?
Yes. I've never known before. I had two serious bouts of depression. I've never recognised what depression was. And then I did have two days, consecutive days, on different occasions, where I was absolutely paralysed by not being able to do anything. And I thought, oh, this is what's called depression. I couldn't move. People said, I Zoomed with my children, and they were enormously concerned and said, couldn't you go for a walk? And I said, no, I can't go for a walk. And they said, why not? And I said, I don't know. I can't go across the road. I can't make a cup of tea. I'm paralysed. And it was a very strange experience, and I think it will make me perhaps understand when people say, I've had serious depression, and there's a considerable boom, isn't that word? Inappropriate word to use, but an abundance of mental illness. I have a tiny chink of insight now into what on earth that feels like.
What did you do?
I sat. I did nothing. I sat, and then I did go, and I sort of tried to get myself talking to it. My brain was not very willing to collaborate. It wasn't very alert. It wanted to melt that. So I tried to say to myself, things will get better. Things will get better. And let's put all this away and go to bed. So I went to bed.
The trouble is that I find I get into that the odd daily night, and I stay in bed. And I thought, don't get up for bed, because I'm already in bed. You have to get up at some point, I think. And at least I've got to a little bit of compensate. You need movement, you need rhythm, you need nothing. The lockdown has taken a pattern of life. And that pattern has been
I think it's true, and I think still gets you locked down, still doing it, is to schedule different things, to know how to cut up my day into different parts. So there are bits of the day when I do my exercises, and then there are bits when I know that I will sit down and read a book, and then there are others when I will do all my emails. So it's rather like being at school and having different hour sessions, history 1 moment, French legs, etc. I change from one subject to another, almost as a routine imposed on myself, so that the passing of the day is organised rather than random.
Excellent idea. I have double Netflix. Joan Bakewell, it's been wonderful to talk to you, and I'm so excited to talk painting with you, and I'm looking forward to landscape artist of the year.
Yes, thank you.
It continues in Scully. St Joan is with us today on the programme. Do please get in touch with your questions or comments Saturday night at bbc.co.uk. You can text on 84844, or you can tweet using the hashtag BBC Saturday Night.
Lots of you are sending in your running away stories this morning. Helen Foster on Facebook says, back in the early 1960s, when mothers left their little angels outside shops in their silver cross prams and pushchairs, I was quite needlessly courageous. I would snap my reins off and off I went. I think I managed 3 run for it before being left with my nan while mum went shopping. I recall being found in a dark cinema by a cleaner. 2 policemen taking it in turns to carry me, asking me if I lived here or there while I dribbled on them. And my parents collected me from Plumstead Police Station, most annoyed that I had been given buns. I was oblivious to the fact that police girls with megaphones were blaring out, "Have you seen a little girl? says, my 6-year-old brother ran away from home and took his 18-month-old sister with him, me. He packed a little case with a spare nappy and 2 apples and set off down the road. I love the details of all these stories. He got to the corner, stopped and sat on the pavement with me. He couldn't go any further as he wasn't allowed to cross the road by himself. We were there for an hour until Dad came home from work, put us both in the back of the car and met Mum, who had been watching us all the while from the garden.
Tim from Shear in Surrey ran away from a tyrannical South Coast boarding school back in the mid-1970s and spent 3 glorious days of freedom, he says, in Brighton, sleeping under a boat on the beach. I had no money and survived on my wits, eventually went back to school driven by hunger. They hadn't even bothered to look for me or contact the police.
Oh, that's sad, isn't it? I ran away before I got sent to boarding school. I was so angry with my parents that they were sending me away. Anyway, not about me. Let's have your stories about running away this morning. This is Saturday Live with Richard Coles and Nikki Baker. Listener Johnny Oates ran away from home when he was 15. He stole his father's credit card, bought a ticket to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and soon realised he wasn't running away from home so much as running away from himself. This was back in the 1980s, as Johnny tells us in his memoir. Johnny, what prompted 15-year-old you to run away to Ethiopia?
Well, like many people, I'd been massively impacted by watching the BBC news broadcast by Michael Burke from northern Ethiopia, showing a famine which he described as a biblical famine now in the 20th century, and it was what gave a spark to Band Aid and Live Aid, but it also sort of lit an anger in myself about why on earth this was allowed to go on whilst we were living in such plenty and excess. And I, with the precociousness of a 15-year-old, I kind of thought, well, I'm the person to fix it. And I suppose it probably would have just remained a fantasy, but one day I was in my dad's study and his credit card, unsigned, new credit card, was on the table. He had the same name as me, at least the same initial, and I kind of thought it was a sign. And I picked it up and I signed it, and I got on a bus to the Ethiopian Airlines office just off Regent Street, and I bought myself a ticket to Ethiopia.
And then what happened?
I got to Ethiopia and I very rapidly discovered that the demand for unskilled 15-year-old English kids was not very great. I went around all the aid agencies who just regarded me with bemusement, and then things became really rather desperate, because I, as a 15-year-old, didn't really realise that all my parents would want was me back home and safe. I thought I'd burnt all my bridges, I failed in this. I was struggling a lot with mental health issues in any case, and with my sexuality in adolescence, and I came to a very, very dark place. Luckily I was rescued just in time by I suppose the Richard Coles of Addis Ababa, an Anglican clergyman called Father Charles Sherlock.
Well, I'll take that. Thank you very much.
So, but at this point, Johnny, I think it's important to point out where you landed up staying, because you were at a rather nice hotel.
That's right. So I arrived in Ethiopia and I had to sign a immigration card. I'd never been out of Europe. I'd never seen one of these before, and of course it demanded to know where you were staying. That was when I had my first misgivings, because I had no idea. And I flicked through the Ethiopian Airlines magazine. The only hotel that was listed there was the Hilton Hotel, so I wrote down the name. The first night I was there, I thought, well, I'll have to sleep rough. But that was a pretty terrifying experience in the brutality of Ethiopia at the time under a Marxist military regime, and it was very frightening indeed. So I hauled myself back from this riverbank and I dusted myself down, and the Hilton was one place that took credit cards, so I booked myself into there.
And then you're feeling really dark you're in a very bad place. And how did Father Charles Sherlock, the Reverend Richard Coles of Ethiopia, but how did he come to your rescue then? What happened?
My dad was a clergyman, is a clergyman, in fact. He was the rector of St Bride's Church at the time, and through his church network, he managed to get in touch with Charles Sherlock. They didn't know where I was, of course, and Charles, very bravely, because the security services in Ethiopia were a pretty nasty bunch of people, he drove out to the airport and he demanded to be allowed to see the immigration cards, which they, to his surprise, allowed him to see. And he went through these piles of them, they were all just piled up in a room and nothing being done with them. And he found the immigration card, which had the Hilton Hotel on that, and that really probably saved my life.
You know that the BBC have their office in Hilton now, did you know that?
I didn't know that.
So I got to swim in that pool and be breathless at that huge altitude. Did you feel breathless when you were there, by the way?
I didn't that first time. I did when I went back later, or at least when I tried to go for a run. But I think I was much more kind of consumed by the mental health struggles I was going through. I don't recall the breathlessness at that time.
So what do you think it was that pulled you through at that point?
I was very lucky that Father Charles Sherlock was somebody who was both a very wise and a very kind person, and he didn't try and tell me what I had to do. He didn't lecture me. He just really said to me, you know, I can't tell you what to do and I can't instruct you, but you really need to understand that your life is far more precious than you're probably willing to believe right now. And he showed an amazing empathy, and he really helped bring me out of myself. He also helped give me a purpose, because he said to me, look, there's nothing you can do here. You're not got any skills, but if you go back, if you gain some skills and some knowledge, just remember that the TV cameras will have forgotten about Africa pretty quickly. Please don't forget about it yourself. And so he really gave me a purpose, and I worked subsequently teaching in Zimbabwe and working as a parliamentary advisor in the first democratic parliament in South Africa, and I've maintained very strong links there throughout my life.
Did you ever run into Father Charles again, Johnny?
Yes, well, funnily enough, in 2013, when I was working as the Chief of Staff for the then Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg, he went on a visit to Ethiopia, which is the kind of diplomatic capital of Africa, and I went with him. And before I went with him, I was talking to my dad, and he said, well, you must try and get in touch with Father Charles and tell him you're going, and you're going with the Deputy Prime Minister. And there's a book, or at least there used to be, called Crockford's, you may know it, which is the sort of clerical who's who. And my dad had a copy, and he found Charles's email address, and I emailed him. And astonishingly, he came back and he said, well, that's amazing, because I am going to be in Addis Ababa that weekend. He had maintained links, although he was a clergyman in Scotland by then, with the church there. And it was just the most amazing coincidence. So I arranged to stay on a couple of days after the end of this visit, and we met up in Addis Ababa, and it was amazing, and allowed me to fill in a lot of this sort of story that I hadn't been aware of from his point of view.
And so did you tell him about being in the final few years of Mandela's presidency and how you'd honoured his suggestion you come back to Africa?
Yeah, we talked about all those things, and obviously I'm still in touch with him now. He very kindly looked at the book and went through it and pointed out all the mistakes and errors, but very usefully, very helpfully helped me out there. So yes, we discussed all of that, and I'm delighted to be in contact, and really to be able to say so many years later such a big thank you to somebody who really helped shape my life and perhaps saved it.
What did your job entail as a parliamentary advisor in South Africa?
Well, as you'll recall, the Parliament, many of the parties in the Parliament, not only had their MPs never been members of Parliament before, they hadn't been allowed to vote before. And so there was a project run by the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, which is a UK-based organisation, which was to provide support to what were then called the previously disadvantaged parties, but principally the parties representing the majority population, the majority black population. When I applied for this scheme to be one of these advisors, I had anticipated that I would work for the ANC, and one of the first things I'd done when I'd come back from Zimbabwe was join the anti-apartheid movement, because whilst I'd been there, I'd visited South Africa trying to see the father of one of my pupils, and I'd seen the horrors of apartheid at first hand. So I jumped at the chance to go back there once democracy had come. In the end, I was assigned to work with the Inkatha Freedom Party, which was principally Zulu party, and I was quite nervous about that because they had been the sort of bête noire in the anti-apartheid movement. But actually, I was persuaded by the person who inspired the scheme, a guy called Richard Cable, who was a member of Parliament, former minister, and he said, well, you're going out there ready to advise as if you're a civil servant, so and you know, they need your support and advice, and you should do that. And it ended up being absolutely fascinating. I learned a lot about them and about their party, and had a much more nuanced view afterwards, and I met some amazing people, worked with Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi and many other figures. But of course I was there in the last year of Mandela's presidency, which was an amazing thing, and I had the real privilege to be in the public gallery in Parliament when he made his last ever speech as president.
Wow. And now you're in the House of Lords. Johnny, thank you so much, and if you want to find out more about Johnny's journey, his book is called I Never Promised You a Rose Garden, and it's out now. We're here until 10:30, so if you have any comments, do share them with us. You can text 84844, email SaturdayLive@bbc.co.uk, and if you're tweeting, we're at BBC Radio 4, hashtag BBC Saturday Live.
Well, it's time for your thank yous now. The slot when we hand over to you, so you may thank someone for a good deed done once, but which you could not or did not thank them for at the time. Today's comes from Brian Corbyn, who we talked to after first lockdown.
The person I would like to thank is somebody who stopped and helped me put my father home after I collapsed on the motorway. It was just before the lockdown started. We had my father with us, he's 95 years old, and I wanted to get him home. So on the Wednesday before the lockdown, we agreed that I was going to take him back to Chichester, where he lives. We're up in the Cotswolds, so it's about a couple of hours drive. And on the morning, I didn't feel that well, didn't have any breakfast. I thought, well, I'll be fine, I'll just carry on anyway. But I was anxious to get Dad home. So I was driving down the motorway and I started to feel extremely ill. So I pull off onto the verge and I got out and somebody stopped in front of me. Two people in the car stopped and then got out and came over to see me. I was a bit groggy, so I can't really remember. But he said he was an army medic, or he used to be an army medic, and could he do anything? But actually was the workman in the road who actually stopped, and I think he must have called the police and the ambulance, I believe. So he agreed to give my wife a call, and so he suggested, well, would you like me to take your dad home? And I thought that was incredibly generous, incredibly good of you to stop in the first place. And so he did, he drove Dad off, and apparently they had a lovely chat all the way down to Chichester, and he got dropped off just outside the house. They got in touch with my wife, who left a message for her, and I think she tried to write the phone number down and got it wrong. So I've not been able to get hold of him. which is a great shame because I think it was a very, very kind thing to do. It was amazing to stop, apart from anything else, because it wasn't an easy place to stop. It was a really generous thing to do, so I'd really like to thank him. I'd like to thank him properly. I was put in the back of an ambulance. They took me to the nearby hospital. I think in the end the result decided that it was some sort of a virus. But as he said, there are other viruses like COVID, he said. So we left it at that.
That was Brian with today's thank you, and happy to say that Brian and his father are both well, and his father received his vaccination yesterday, according to our team of Body Scout researchers. Do get in touch with your thank yous, and if you haven't recognised the person being thanked, or you are the person being thanked, we're especially looking for you.
We're taking your running away stories this morning, and this is from Cecilia, who says, my son Pat was 6, and after probably being asked to do something he clearly didn't want to do, decided to run away. He grabbed a small case and his teddy, left a note, opened the door, and off he went. His note read, gone to live somewhere else. Ever the English teacher, I said to my husband, oh, look, perfect spelling and lovely handwriting, to which my husband said, that's fine, but don't you think you should go after him? Thank you for that, Cecilia.
Gary Horrocks has tweeted to say, during a stressful period of my student life, I reflected on Agatha Christie's mysterious 1926 disappearance, so decided to run off and spend 3 nights in an overpriced tawdry B&B in Brighton. Well, that's what you're saying, Gary. Nobody clocked my absence, and all my petulance achieved was an overdraft. There you go, you need to have set these things up.
Absolutely. I was a particularly unhappy teenager at boarding school and took it into my head to simply go home one day in the middle of a geography lesson. This involved a 3-hour train journey. I excused myself to the teacher, ran through the woods to the boarding house, got changed and walked down to the railway station. When I got out at Waterloo, I walked slap bang into my father, who couldn't understand how I had turned up on a school day in the middle of London. He used to go up to London twice a year for a meeting, and my escape from school happened to coincide with one of these rare days. Sadly, after a brief interlude, I was returned to school.
Beginning to wonder, from Sally, I'm beginning to wonder if anyone was actually ever in a boarding school in the 1970s, because so many of them have got in touch to say how they ran away. This comes from Fabrizio Carpanini. He was at boarding school in a rural part of Herefordshire in the 70s when a friend called Toby had a romantic breakup with his 6th form girlfriend, which left him very upset. He decided to run away. He confided in a couple of us, anxious and ourselves, had no money, no idea where he was going. Out of loyalty to him, we decided to allow him a head start of 3 hours before reporting his plan. The housemaster grabbed the nearest school bus when he told him, packed us in, and off we set to find Toby. As we exited the school gates, we looked to our right for oncoming traffic, and there he was, still waiting at the bus stop. 300 miles in 3 hours. Didn't he want to go, did he?
No. Last year, a professional young couple from Dublin entered and won a competition to become the resident summer caretakers of Great Blasket Island. It's the westernmost point of Ireland and is often described as the last stop before America. It's been uninhabited since 1953, when the last residents were evacuated due to the increasingly extreme and unsafe weather conditions. And there's no electricity, no hot water, and no Wi-Fi. So, Annie Burney, what was the attraction?
Well, the Blasket Island, the Great Blasket Island, looms large in the psyche and the minds of Irish people. A lot of us grow up learning about this place, and I was lucky enough to encounter this place quite early on. My parents brought me from Waterford, where I live, down to the southwest of Ireland in Kerry, and we got on the boat and we went out to the island. And sure, being a teenager, I suppose I didn't appreciate it as much as I could at the time. But after we visited the island, my dad gave me a book written by somebody who lived there through the latter half of the 1800s and into the 1900s. And the book was about ordinary everyday life, the ups and downs, the tragedies, the community there. And I suppose, like many others, I just devoured the book over a summer and just wondered at this place and the resilience of the people that lived there. So I suppose this island, for many of us, you know, we would have grown up hearing about it, reading the really famous literature of the island. But then another layer of the attraction as well was myself and my partner Owen. We had been living and working in Dublin. We had been commuting, and like, Dublin is an amazing city, of course, but we had been dreaming for a little while about a slightly different life. And as often is the case, we've been talking about moving down at the country in Ireland, maybe having a little bit more space around us, living in a slightly like slower pace. And we were talking about it, but we weren't doing anything about it.
So when you saw this advert for it was a competition, you had to prove something, did you, both of you?
Absolutely, yeah. It was essentially a job application. So we did. We had to prove something. There was there was a lot of interest, as you know. We had put in our application, and we had gotten it in quite early, and so we were watching the numbers of people going for the job in every part of the world just growing and growing. And at that time, I think we just kind of gave up on the dream a small bit. We just said it was absolutely lovely while it lasted. But yes, I suppose for the job, I think two important things were that you had to prove that you were passionate about the place and understood the complexities of the history of the place, but also that you could be very organised as well, because as you can imagine, our main role there was to look after 3 cottages where people could stay overnight on the island. So you had to be very organised. Your standard had to be extremely high, doing this and keeping houses safe during the pandemic. So if you got too distracted by the amazingness of where you were living, that wouldn't be great either. You had to keep your head down sometimes.
Now you say amazing, but to me, no electricity, no hot water, no Wi-Fi, it's just no for me. So you obviously have much deeper layers than I do. What else was it that made you passionate? I mean, there might not be people on the island, but there's wildlife, isn't there?
There's incredible wildlife. Yeah, there's hares, there's rabbits, there's shearwater birds, there's 2 donkeys on the island, and there's actually a massive great eel colony as well. It's got a water, as far as I know, of the national total of great eels. And I think as many as 1,800 eels have been counted on this strand on the island at any given time. And in the night times you can hear the eels howling as it drifts up to where the cottages are. So I know on paper it seems as if it might be a tough existence, and I think certainly for the people in the 1800s it must have been. But for us, the inconvenience of a cold shower, for having to light a candle in the night instead of switching on a light switch, it just pales in comparison to, I suppose, what you saw when you woke up, and just that chance to kind of really immerse yourself in such a historical place, and a place that you're just surrounded by nature, and you're just, your whole life is controlled by the elements. So that experience, I suppose, for us, just overshadowed any kind of mild inconvenience.
How did it impact your relationship, you and her?
I think ultimately it did. It was good for our relationship. It did. I suppose make us stronger. We saw sides of each other that there's no way we would have ever seen on the mainland.
That can go either way, can't it?
It could. Sorry.
That can go either way, can't it? Discovering aspects of your partner you've not seen before.
Absolutely, yeah, without a doubt. So I mean, I saw Owen grab a sheep with his 2 hands and throw it over a fence, a sheep that had gotten out. So I don't think I would have seen that on the mainland, let's say not for a few years anyway. And I suppose we just, it's kind of these situations that you come across where you have to think very quickly. So for instance, one evening there was a very, very bad storm, and our house flooded up to our ankles. A little river came in the back door and out the front door. So, you have to think on your feet, and you see maybe in the relationship who's good, who has a very positive mental attitude.
And who does?
Yeah. Yeah, and who's able to think on their feet and maybe strategize a little bit, which maybe would be slightly more me.
Maybe slightly more. I love that. So you mentioned cold showers. Obviously the extremes of weather you have to contend with.
Mm-hmm.
And what were the other parts that were really very difficult for you?
an interesting one, and one that we didn't foresee, was a certain loss of independence and spontaneity, let's say. And I know this sounds like such a strange thing to say, but it was one of the things we had to contend with. So we stayed on the island. We didn't come off the island for the months that we were there. And in a way, we were very lucky compared to the people who would have lived on the island when these books were being written, because our washing and the bed linens with the cottages and houses was done on the mainland, and also food was brought to us as well. It wasn't something that the islanders would have experienced. But it's an interesting experience to, I suppose, to plan ahead so much, to rule any spontaneity out of your life, because everything down to the candles, the amount of coal on the island, the food you're going to be ordering is planned to the nth degree. And I remember when we came back onto the mainland, we just went for a food shop, and just the amazingness of just saying, what are we going to have for dinner this evening? So it was a strange one. Of all the things that I think I had to grapple with the most, that loss of the independence that I would have been so used to, and the variety that I would have been so used to on the mainland. And the islanders would have often spoken about, or people now who write about the islanders would have spoken about this idea of mehel, which is an Irish word. It kind of deals with community and working toward the common goal. And I think that was very important on the island. No one person or no one family could survive by themselves. It was about everybody seeing each other through good times and through bad times as well. We definitely had that. We had so many supports on the mainland, and that was really vital to our survival there. But it is interesting, that slight loss of independence that we experienced.
Annie Burney, thank you so much for sharing that story. And if you have a fascinating life story, yours or someone's you'd like to share it with us, you can email saturdaylive@bbc.co.uk, text us on 84844, and if you're using Twitter, it's #BBC Saturday Live.
Joan Bakewell, I think of you very much as an urbanite, and I don't know if you are entirely urbanite, but with the idea of co-caretaking a remote island off some rain-lashed shore appeal to you?
Well, I love the idea of the challenge and the solving of problems. I've always enjoyed solving problems. I think there were probably too many on that island for me, both the weather, the food and the cold. But yes, I quite like, it's like a dare, isn't it? Dare you do that. And of course, I couldn't resist the invitation, but I don't think it would have been a solution, an isolation I could have borne with, really. Too much introspection.
How about you like connection, it seems to me, Joan, and how have you managed to connect to the house? I don't know if you and Johnny Oates go for tea and buns in the members' bun room or whatever it is when you're there, but I mean, how did you connect to Parliament through Zoom or through technology? Does that change that experience?
What is very interesting is how successful the House of Lords is in running its affairs at a distance. Everybody is on their laptops, the debates continue, votes pile in all the time. Only about 30 people can sit in the chamber, which normally holds about 500. So people don't want to go in, as well as avoiding infection. They prefer to work from home. And the House of Lords has got itself brilliantly organised. There are loads of different sort of websites, and you're well informed, you get tipping off to various debates. The party, of course, the Labour PSA, the party is very good at sending briefings and suggestions and voting patterns and so on. So it's a very engaging enterprise. So that's part of my afternoon regularly.
How's it been for you, John? Similar sort of experience?
I think the House of Lords has done it very well, and better than the Commons, I think, because of the way we're allowed to vote. And having said that, I don't think there is any substitute from actually being there, partly because of the interactions that you have with other people when you're actually there, and partly because I think ministers frankly get away with murder because you can't intervene on them as you would normally. So it's the House authorities have organised it very well, and I think it's done as well as it can be in the virtual world. But I think Parliament is best when it's in person.
Essentially, there's so many things where we've managed on Zoom because we've had to, those have been created, I'm thinking of church in particular, but there is no substitute for being in the same place at the same time, being in the same air. hopefully not infectious. And so
You change the atoms in the room, don't you? There's something magical about that.
it's like with guests, isn't it? I mean, all our guests
Yes,
today
I
are not
agree. John is absolutely right. The whole sense of community when you're there is very good, because the House of Lords lacks that kind of heavily, insultingly combative tone that you often get in the Commons.
So I'm very sorry. I'm afraid I'm going to have to crush this community. Otherwise, we're going to crash the pips, which we don't want to do. But you're listening to Saturday Live with Joan Bateman, Johnny Oates, Annie Burney, Mark Hannah coming up. We're going to have inheritance tracks also from Yolanda Brown, and resume this conversation, I hope. That's all after the news with Chris Aldridge.
BBC News at 10 o'clock. There are calls for the UK's aviation industry to be given more government support after tough new coronavirus travel restrictions were announced. From the early hours of Monday morning, anyone arriving in the UK must show proof of a negative COVID-19 test 72 hours before travelling and then self-isolate for up to 10 days. The move has broadly been welcomed. Aviation Minister Robert Courts believes this will be effective.
I have confidence in the measures that we have because they are robust. If you look, for example, at the Americans who did close their borders, they've still had a very bad time with the virus, one of the worst results in the world. We've also got things like freight to consider as well, so we have to have the free flow of critical supplies, which is important that we keep an eye on as well.
Further measures to help stop the spread of COVID-19 have come into force in Scotland. People are already being encouraged to stay at home as much as possible, but the Scottish Government has introduced new rules for shops and takeaways. Our Scotland correspondent Alexander McKenzie explains the latest changes.
You can still click and collect certain items, things that are seen as more essential, like baby equipment, clothes, shoes, some homeware, so those are still available, but you can't just turn up to get them. You need to have an appointment. And also, if you are going out for your takeaway coffee this morning, you'll see some differences. You can't just go into the cafe or restaurant. You will have to wait outside, and you will get your coffee through a hatch.
The government says Pfizer slowing deliveries of its coronavirus vaccine to Europe won't affect the UK's target to administer jabs to people most vulnerable to COVID by the middle of next month. The pharmaceutical company announced a temporary change yesterday, saying it will allow them to make upgrades and boost production. The US Health Secretary Alex Azar has resigned, describing the storming of Congress by Donald Trump's supporters last week as an assault on democracy. But Mr. Azar said he would stay in his role until Wednesday, when Joe Biden takes office, to ensure a smooth transfer of power during the pandemic. An activist group based in Washington says 5 pro-democracy protesters who escaped Hong Kong last year by boat have arrived in the United States. Michael Bristow reports.
The 5 fled Hong Kong by boat for Taiwan last July. At the time, Taiwanese media reported that they were picked up by the island's Coast Guard as their vessel drifted after running out of fuel. A statement from the US-based organisation has welcomed them to America, the Hong Kong Democracy Council, said they could have easily perished at sea. Other activists who attempted the same route were detained by China and have now been imprisoned. In their new home in the US, this group said they were now safe, but their hearts remained in Hong Kong.
Michael Bristow reporting. BBC News.
Chris Aldridge, thank you, and welcome back to Saturday Live with Nikki Bailey and Richard Coles. With us this morning, the indefatigable Baroness Joan Bakewell, who's been talking about cancel culture and her watercolour abilities. Johnny Oates has been sharing his tale of the boy who thought he was running away to save the world, but was really running from himself. Annie Burney explained why she wanted to be a caretaker on a remote Irish island with no electricity. And we're soon to hear about the mysterious Miss Cashmere's garden from Mark Hamer. I can't wait.
Anything with the word cashmere in it, exciting.
Yeah,
It's true. But we can now talk by the miracle of telephony to Sue Rodwell-Smith. Good morning, Sue.
Good morning. There's somebody just arrived to take my dog out with Sparky said. I'll tell you.
That's all right, it all gives texture to the programme. I'm very well, it's lovely to hear about you, but we're going back a few years when you were on holiday in Plymouth.
Yes, 1962 this was. And I used to go down to Plymouth to stay with my nan and granddad for our holidays, and I worked in a departmental store. And one of the girls there had a boyfriend, and they were going somewhere the next day. She didn't
because I haven't seen it. What is it? And I think it's interesting that music was the start of that conversation within us. they are beautiful parents and brought me up to be proud of who I am and proud of being Yolanda, not the fact that, you know, I might be defined by my gender or my skin. And so it was, I guess, probably a tricky conversation for them to think, okay, you know, but also